Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you, Professor, for your kind words of introduction and welcome. I would also like to thank the Curatorium and its president. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to spend a few moments with you. It's very interesting for me and very stimulating to be able to talk to you not so much about something that you know better than me, namely international law, everything that it has built, or the hopes it has given rise to, but to speak to you as a practitioner, to speak on the basis of my experience. It so happens that for 19 years I have found myself at the heart of power in my country, France, working with President François Mitterrand, or as Foreign Secretary during the third cohabitation in France between President Jacques Chirac and Prime Minister Lionel Jospin. So I'm talking to you as a practitioner, not as a theoretician. 20 years spent at the heart of power. I found myself almost as often on the right as on the left because of cohabitation, and therefore my statement is in no way partisan, not dogmatic, not ideological. These statements are really based on my experience. Allow me to start, and not just as a tribute to the remarkable individuals who are in the auditorium this afternoon, who are masters, experts in international law, so it's not just because of their presence, but I would like to make one first simple point. I will have 5 in total. First point, I know, I have participated in, I'm also imbued with, even though I didn't study law, strictly speaking, I'm imbued with these long-standing hopes. You could go back to before Immanuel Kant, you could go well before then. There was in fact a very remarkable address yesterday by Professor Yves Daudet. His presentation was historical and philosophical, and I subscribe to it wholly. What I'm saying is that I completely understand this, and I have every empathy for this position. I understand the extraordinary hopes around the world at the end of the 1914-1918 war through President Wilson's 14 points and then Wilson's philosophy itself, even though it may not have been shared by all other leaders necessarily, but nevertheless it led to the creation of the League of Nations. That in itself is quite an optimistic term, League of Nations. And then the creation of the International Labour Organization, and another moment of optimism with the creation of the United Nations. You could ask, are they really united, these nations? But still, the movement towards the United Nations was an effort in that direction. And I'm not forgetting the International Court of Justice. And then a third moment of contemporary optimism, that was the end of the Soviet Union, and that's the real date, not the fall of the wall. The real date is the end of the Soviet Union, a movement which paved the way for the International Criminal Court. All of this I am familiar with. And I have experienced this through my studies and also through my meetings with leaders who were also very much marked by these philosophies. However, I had to do my job. And I had to do that in the real world. There's not necessarily an opposition between the two. There's actually a lot of bridges, a lot of convergence points between the two, a lot of links. But the real world that I found myself in with François Mitterrand at the age of 34, I was diplomatic advisor, that was still the world of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, not the beginning of it, but nevertheless, it was still the Cold War. The USSR, Brezhnev in 1981. It was Brezhnev, then there was Andropov, and then there were 2 or 3 other leaders before we came to Gorbachev. And it was the world where what mattered was the balance of powers. People at the time studied carefully military balances, technological, economic, strategic balances, nuclear deterrence, endless discussions about nuclear deterrence. What's the real nature of a deterrent? And there were several schools of thought within this debate on deterrence. That was the reality in 1981. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. This ultimately led to its downfall. That was the situation at the time. Europe at the time was in a situation of paralysis. It was completely stuck because of Mrs. Thatcher, her demands. She wanted the UK contribution to be compensated for. I want my money back. That was her leitmotif, later shared by others, but no agreement was possible in Europe at all. Europe was stuck. It was a Europe of 10 at the time. It should normally have been easier to find a compromise, but that was not the case. So that was the world. And at the time in Europe, there was a major battle raging around security in Europe. Nuclear deterrence, that's intercontinental missiles which threaten the country of the main adversary, but it's also medium-range and short-range missiles. There was a whole debate in Europe at the time around that. I'll come back to it in a moment. The fact that the Soviets had set up in Eastern Europe new medium-range missiles, the SS-20s, that could actually only strike Germany. So there was a whole discussion on the other side within NATO. NATO, which has been managing security in Europe since 1949 at the behest of the Europeans. It's not a proof of US imperialism. It really was something that the Europeans begged for in 1949. So a whole discussion about whether or not we should also position missiles on our side. And the only missiles available at the time were American Pershing missiles. It was a whole debate about Euro missiles starting in 1979. Furthermore, in that world, there was also a deadlock, a complete deadlock in the Near East. Not particularly original per se, but what I'm trying to tell you is that there were no real prospects at the time in the Near East or in the Middle East. I would tend to speak really about the Near East. That was a situation in the 1980s, which then evolved. First of all, in terms of security in Europe, and then, subsequently, the very concept of deterrence. Regarding security in Europe, and this was in fact one of my first clashes, I was a young advisor at the time, and I clashed with the approach adopted by President Mitterrand. François Mitterrand was very much inspired by great scholars of international law, the hopes of the 20s and 30s. He'd also experienced the complete collapse of France in 1940 and everything that that led to, and therefore he was torn. In his speeches, he was prepared to talk about collective security, but in practice, he didn't really believe in it yet. He saw it as an objective, an aspiration. When you had to take a decision, therefore, on the Euro missiles case, he didn't refer to the international law principles, even though he was imbued with them. He didn't mention collective security particularly either. He came to a conclusion, which is a fairly standard one, namely that security is something that is derived from the balance of powers, the balance of deterrence. For now, as things stand, it might be a pity, there could be other prospects in future, but when you have to take a decision in the heat of the moment, as a responsible decision maker, you can't just carry on talking, you have to decide, you have to take a stance. And the position adopted by the president was presented before the Bundestag in Bonn at the time. He'd been invited by Helmut Schmidt, but in the meantime there'd been a change in the government alliance in Bonn, so it was Helmut Kohl who received him. François Mitterrand gave a speech and he talked about the balance of powers. He said that that should lie at the basis of our security for now. So either the USSR withdraw their SS-20s, or they have to accept that there will be comparable missiles on our side in order to keep up deterrence. Now, in Europe, at the time, the whole of Europe, including the Netherlands, which is where we're meeting, but around the whole of Europe, the whole left, youth, pacifists, they all said, no, you mustn't provoke the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had positioned the SS-20s, not the others, but the dominant discourse, idealistic, also based on fear, was not to provoke. The first provocation, of course, was the SS-20s. And that's why Helmut Schmidt, a social democrat German chancellor at the time, who didn't particularly like Mitterrand because he was friends with Giscard, he was very disappointed that Giscard wasn't re-elected, but nevertheless, he invited Mitterrand and he tried to lecture him on realism to some extent. François Mitterrand gave his speech. The whole discussion continued throughout 1983, and ultimately the Bundestag decided that yes, seeing as the Soviets were not withdrawing their missiles, we had to put Pershings on the other side. It might be regrettable, it might be a great pity, but we have to go through this stage. Several years later, by the way, both sides withdrew their missiles, but I'm just trying to explain how that decision came about, the procedure. Incidentally, on that speech, there's a sentence that's often quoted, which you may have heard, a sentence by François Mitterrand saying, "The missiles are on the east, the pacifists are on the west." It's a nice formula. It actually came from my deputy at the time, a young man who unfortunately died at a young age, Jean-Michel Gaillard. But it wasn't in the Bundestag speech. There are lots of mistakes like that. People talk about the address by President Mitterrand in Cancun. There never was such a thing. The actual citation comes from a speech given by Mitterrand at the Palais Royal in Belgium. But the idea, of course, is the same. Whatever François Mitterrand may have picked up from his professors as a student of law at the time, the conclusion he came to was that it was the balance of powers that would guarantee our security. Then, when Mitterrand started looking at the question of the Near East, he was actually surrounded by idealists. He said, who told him, yes, we can play a role, we can unlock things, either because they had close relations with moderate Palestinians or realist Arabs or Israeli peace camps, activists, depending. And it led to an extraordinary speech given by François Mitterrand, where he doesn't really mention international law much at all. He could have done. With the Near East, you could draw up a long, long list of all sorts of international rules that have been breached, violated, not applied, UN Security Council resolutions that have never been implemented, but he decided to opt for a different tack. He was a historic friend of Israel, and quite a while ago he'd already reached the conclusion that one day the Israelis would have to take into account the Palestinian fact. In fact, even before Giscard's election, a long time before, he'd already met with Arafat in Cairo. That was quite a risky endeavour on the part of a Western European politician at the time, and his purpose was to try to persuade Israelis of goodwill that they should accept a discussion or something, some kind of compromise, because there were two peoples, one land. So he gave the speech before the Knesset in March 1982. It so happens that Mitterrand improvised a lot. He was a very gifted orator, but in such a big speech, he was very careful. Every word was weighed up carefully. We didn't have speechwriters at the time. Leaders gave their own speeches. And he said before the Knesset, you need to be very careful. He wrote a text, and the night before, at the King David Hotel, he sounded out Claude Chesson, who was pro-Arab, and Jacques Attali, who was perhaps not exactly on the same line, but the same team. He sounded them out to test his speech with these two individuals. And then he gave a speech, Knesset, March 82, and he spoke about a state for the Palestinians. At the end of a long sentence, with a question mark, but still, he was the first Western leader to even dare to have this idea, saying it was in Israel's interest in the long term, for the Near East in the long term. And the only leader who backed him up on this was the Austrian Chancellor at the time, Bruno Kreisky. He was an old, liberal, Jewish militant, very anti-Likud, or what Likud was to become subsequently, and who said, yes, we should go for this. But of course, Austria's weight was not quite the same as that of France. Anyway, Mitterrand took that step. I reread his speech recently, and I noticed that he doesn't really mention international law. There's one sentence on resolutions. It's a great pity, but I think he realized that there was not really any point. He knew that if he listed UN Security Council resolutions, he wouldn't necessarily persuade members of the Knesset who were of two minds. There was Begin at the time, who unified the right in Israel subsequently, and of course he was very much opposed to this position adopted by the president. There's another very interesting example from that same period in history, and that's a debate on deterrence. This has to do with international law, or more specifically, it's a moral consideration. Deterrence is something that arose as a concept after the Second World War. There was a whole scale, if you like, in terms of the types of arms, missiles, bombardiers, missiles, short range, medium range, guided, not guided, etc. And then in 1983, President Reagan gave a big speech in which he said that we could actually move on from deterrence. We could get rid of deterrence. We're going to set up instead a global protection system with satellites, with laser weapons, and they will destroy any missile the minute it is triggered. Of course, at the time, this didn't exist. Technologically, scientifically, it didn't exist. But Reagan had been persuaded by engineers from various US companies, persuaded that this would be feasible. It wasn't technically possible. It would have taken 50 years of testing before coming up with this system. It didn't exist, but it was all about the concept. And then when President Reagan, President of the United States of America, said, we can turn the page on nuclear deterrence because it is immoral, because it is obsolete, obviously that gave rise to a lot of responses, a shockwave throughout the whole of the Western world, which until then had been protected by United States deterrence since the end of the Second World War. So there was a whole debate, moral, philosophical, ethical, and Americans were in favor of this discourse. They thought that deterrence was bad in itself. To obtain your own security by threatening others with annihilation is bad. Or the strategists said, not at all, this is not true. A strategy or a policy, whatever it may be, that allows you to actually guarantee peace, and indeed it had been guaranteeing peace since the end of the war, even vis-à-vis the USSR and the USA, those two, the two big nuclear powers, not necessarily everywhere else, but still it can't be bad. So there's intention and there's results. You have to look at both in this debate. So a big debate took place around that, and that rekindled the anti-nuclear movement in large parts of Western Europe. I'm not talking about nuclear energy, that's a separate chapter. Here I really am talking about strategic issues. So a whole debate on whether or not we should rid ourselves of nuclear weapons in order to make the world a safer place to live, or whether we should create such a safe world that we'll no longer need nuclear deterrence. The reasoning is not at all the same. The approach is not at all the same. Since then, I'm sure you'll have noticed that no nuclear power has got rid of its nuclear weapons. There was the Treaty on Non-Proliferation, which is based on an accepted structural inequality. Those who have nuclear weapons will keep them, those who don't won't, but together we will work towards disarmament. At the time, 30 or 40 years ago, it was feared that by the year 2000 there would be 30 or 40 nuclear powers. That didn't happen. So it was a purely strategic debate, contingent upon a moral approach or a philosophical approach, and the decision makers, heads of state, heads of government, none of them dare to take the risk of surrendering their nuclear weapons. None of them have done so. Even those who would be in favor, in principle. Europeans, for instance, would like to see a reduction in the number of weapons. None of them, notwithstanding that, have been confident enough to say, well, in 30 or 40 years' time, the world will be governed by international law. It will be such a peaceful place that I can take the risk of divesting myself of my nuclear weapons. None of them have done it. You can say that's a pity. You can have a different philosophical or moral approach. I'm certainly not going to make any value judgments. I'm just relaying to you what I experienced during this period of time. Then we can move on to the second period, where I was again at the heart of the machine, and this is the end of the Soviet Union, the end of East-West. This is quite interesting. If I were to sound you out, you would probably say the turning point was the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall. But when you go to Poland, they'll say, no, the important moment was not the fall of the wall. We started well before in Poland, thanks to John Paul II, thanks to Wałęsa. If you go to Hungary, the Hungarians will tell you, well, we cut through the fence months before. East Germans could actually exit East Germany through Hungary months before the fall of the wall. The opening of the wall is a very symbolic moment. I open an aside, I'm looking at you, the world you live in, your age. You live in a world that is completely dominated by images, which is, of course, very moving and very good, but it can lead you to the wrong conclusions. I organized a seminar at Sciences Po in Paris on the perception of threat. I showed them pictures, for instance, of people on the Berlin Wall with their pickaxes hacking away. This was Sciences Po in Paris, quite a prestigious university, I'm sure you'll agree. And the students said, wow, these people are so brave, so courageous. I mean, just imagine they toppled this wall by using their own little pickaxes. And I said, no, these pictures were taken the day after the wall was actually opened up by customs officials on the eastern German side. They no longer had instructions. The country was falling apart. So people started crossing. Even Mrs. Merkel, she crossed over, had a piece of cake, went back home a couple of hours later. So I said to my students, the people that you see in these images with their pickaxes, they're trophy hunters. They're looking for souvenirs. They come from Western Berlin and they want to collect a little piece of the wall and then they can put them on their bookshelves. So that's the kind of clash that you'll see time and time again in strategic thinking. You've got an image, which you've seen, which has moved you, and then you've got real strategic thinking, and that's what real international relations is about. And therefore, the real date is the end of the Soviet Union. 2 years later, in other words, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine came together and they said, right, we're going to take our independence. They told Gorbachev, you need to leave now. You can't be president of the USSR. There is no USSR. And we move into a new phase, the so-called global world. Difference is, didn't quite know how to define it. During the period of the Cold War, you knew what was East, you knew what was West. There was also the Third World. East and West were fighting over that. What about the global world? What is that exactly? President Bush, Senior, not to be confused with Junior, had announced a new world order under the enlightened leadership of the United States of America. They would take care of global security. Somebody has to. We don't particularly want to, but we are a reluctant sheriff. Somebody has to take on that role. This was his vision, an American vision, an optimistic vision, and a very proactive one. But then there was another school of thought, Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama, a great US intellectual who wrote a short while after these events, he wrote a book called The End of History, because now everybody agrees on democracy, on the markets. Everybody agrees this is going to be rolled out across the board, so that's the end of history. There might be a few states who are resistant, but they too will be persuaded. There is the end of history because there's no one willing to go into battle anymore. There's no disagreement anymore. Fukuyama was very influential in the West in the 1990s with this American triumphalism, European optimism, perhaps slightly naively. And then along comes another great American intellectual, Samuel Huntington. And he said, my dear friend, you've got this completely wrong. Of course, these people all know each other from Harvard days. He said, you've got this completely wrong. We're in fact threatened by a clash of civilizations. And in intellectual circles around the world, people were shocked by this, horrified. They believed in multilateralism. How could you talk about civilizations? What does civilization mean? In fact, the very same people who said that there were more conflicts within civilizations also said civilizations do not exist. Anyway, they thought that this point of view was very pessimistic and not an avenue to explore. In the 1990s, I would say that the world was with Fukuyama primarily. Then there was September 11 and a number of other developments around the world, the visible emergence within Islam, within Sunni Islam in particular, and the Western world starts to side more with Huntington. Although it has to be said that Huntington, if you read his texts, never wanted a clash. He never said that a clash would be a good thing or that we should work towards it. He just said there is the threat of a clash. This is a debate I had often with President Chirac. I remember one time in particular, we saw each other on a daily basis for 5 years, and he said, I'm not at all in favor of this theory of a clash. And I answered, I prefer to still fight the risk rather than the theory, because there are some elements of risk there. And he said to me, you can't talk about a clash of cultures, that would be an absence of culture. And I agreed, yes, there are dominant cultures on both sides, but that is actually much more dangerous, much more widespread, much more violent. An endless debate, if you like. And it certainly left its mark on this period. And you'll see that in different schools of thought, with the exception of Fukuyama, none of them will say, right, we've reached a stage where international law can be properly implemented, not just adopt laws or resolutions, but make sure that they are enforced. Even in the Fukuyama school, which is the dominant one at the time in Europe, not even they were bold enough to go that far. There are lots of people working like Benedictine monks on international law, They wouldn't go that far. And in fact, during that period of time, what strikes me is that this was a point in time where the West thought it had triumphed. It was the end of the Soviet Union, the USSR. The West thought it had triumphed, but the West had actually lost its monopoly. I do emphasize monopoly of power, of influence, of values, defining what is good, defining what is evil, defining the law. We find ourselves here in an auditorium where you probably don't think in terms of the West, you would think in terms of an international community, of course. But my geopolitical experience is not quite that. The West took the lead for 3 or 4 centuries for world history. Whether it did so well or not well is a different debate, but it had that monopoly. Historians will subsequently try to explain to us how this came to be. A small group of European nations, not united, in terrible rivalry, in fact, with one another, how they managed to colonize 2/3 of the world. And why did 2/3 of the world allow this to happen? Not all, of course. You have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. Anyway, these were different times, you might argue. And I would say that there's no responsibility handed down from one generation to the next. This is not the Bible. It's a mystery, but it's a mystery for historians. We find ourselves in a different world compared to that. And so for me, the key question is, whatever the past, whatever you think of it, the West lost its monopoly. Some theoreticians, in particular Asian ones, will go even further than that. A geopolitician from Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani, who was very influenced by Lee Kuan Yew, of Indian origin, but brought up in a Singaporean and Chinese culture. So Mahbubani said, no, this is the end of the Western parenthesis, the end of the parenthesis, closing the parenthesis. And he said that this incredible phenomenon, European and US domination for 3 or 4 centuries, it's a historical accident, it's quite astonishing, but now we are in a different place. And he even goes so far as to say this is happening too quickly, it's too dangerous. And what he would like to see is a stronger Europe. That's yet another debate. A stronger Europe. What would that mean in his mind, in his thinking? That's another question. Nothing to do with treaties or with procedures, more to do with your mental approach, as athletes might say. You know, what do Europeans hope to achieve within this rat race of Europe? Anyway, a few examples to illustrate the dilemmas faced by decision makers within that context. A couple of examples. First of all, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. This is when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Not a particularly complicated case study. Saddam Hussein had his reasons. He managed this war with Iran for 8 years. Incredible, monstrous human loss and sacrifice. He did this to save the Emirates, the Arab region. The others did not pay for this. They did not keep their side of the bargain. So he thought, well, they did not keep their side of the bargain. I'm going to help myself. I'm going to reach into the safe. I'm going to annex Kuwait. In terms of international law, of course, this is wholly unacceptable, whichever way you look at it. But there was this first aggression or first example of a member state of the United Nations leading to the disappearance of another. There have been many attacks, but this was the first case of disappearance. And at the time, it was easy to reach an agreement. Western leaders, there was no US pressure, a spontaneous agreement, and even Gorbachev was on side. Saddam Hussein, who probably hadn't understood how much the world had changed, he thought, old school, that the USSR will protect me. And Gorbachev, of course, had other problems to deal with. It was not in his interest to protect an Iraqi regime which was indefensible. So a mechanism is set up with the agreement of the UN Security Council, no vetoes, and a whole mechanism. Step by step, militarily, they try to persuade Saddam Hussein that if he doesn't withdraw from Kuwait spontaneously, he will be forced out militarily. This goes on for months. France plays its usual original role in diplomacy. They keep saying to Saddam Hussein, leave, leave. If you leave, there'll be no problem. It'll be resolved. He refuses to believe that. He doesn't leave. So ultimately, an operation takes place and Iraq is thrown out, forced out of Kuwait. And at that point in time, George Herbert Bush, the one who died in December last, called various leaders around the world, including President Mitterrand, and he said, what should we do now? And Mitterrand answered, now you should stop. We have a UN Security Council resolution for once, it doesn't happen that often, for once, US policy, our policies are aligned with a UN Security Council resolution and therefore with international law. So let's leave it at that. Let's stop. If you now enter Baghdad, if you try to topple the regime, you'll lose your legal support, your moral support. And George Bush answered, yes, you're right, I agree. Incidentally, this was also the advice given to me by my Chief of Staff, Colin Powell, who was to become, of course, Secretary of State later on in a more difficult context for him. So there was an agreement. The United States stopped. Some who wanted more interference deplored that decision, but to go beyond would not have been legitimate, politically speaking. Not at all. So that's a fairly straightforward case in terms of interference or international action and the West over the last 30 or 40 years. Of course, here it wasn't just the West, there was also the Soviet Union. It's an interesting case study because you couldn't really criticize it, not compared to the other cases I shall mention. There is a more complicated case, which I had to deal with as a minister, and that was the case of Kosovo. Globally speaking, I would say that the end of the Soviet Union was handled very well. German reunification was a collective masterpiece. But conversely, when it came to the disintegration of Yugoslavia, that was completely chaotic. Nobody was able to manage the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, neither the Yugoslavs, nor the Americans, nor the Russians, nor the Europeans, nor the Pope. Nobody. The country broke up. There was no longer the strong hand of Tito to keep everything together, and the Serbs wanted to regain their position because Tito had been a Croat and wanted to curb their position of influence. The Croats were not happy with the Serbian minorities, etc. This was settled very realistically, I would say, by the Americans in 1995, if memory serves, at the Dayton Conference. The Americans, and this has nothing to do with principles, this is to do with reality. They simply took note of the elections after the conflicts, and where there was Croatian domination, they accepted it. Where there was Serbian domination, they accepted it. They took a snapshot, if you like, of the situation, and that at least put an end to it. But there was one pending issue, namely that of Kosovo, and that cropped up again a few years later, at the beginning of my mandate as minister, in fact. What happened? You had pro-independence forces in Kosovo, or Kosovars who certainly wanted to rebel against Serbian domination and ill treatment, and they were divided in two camps. There was one that was in favor of diplomatic negotiation, the Rugova camp, and then there was another wing, far more violent, which was the Taci camp. There was a disagreement between the two. We didn't have an international obligation, but since this was happening in Europe, 2 hours flight from Paris, legally speaking, of course, that's an absurd argument, but you had this feeling of being close to the events in public opinion. So what did we do at the time? Well, there were 4 ministers, Germany, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, and we recreated the contact group, a diplomatic structure that had been created by Alain Juppé and Klaus Kinkel at the time of the Bosnia case, and it was rekindled for the purposes of Kosovo. So we had discussions with Madeleine Albright on board and also the Russian minister, Igor Ivanov. And we thought, well, we must find a solution. The Serbian army or the Serbian militia, we're not quite sure which, but either way, they need to stop the ill treatment of Kosovars. We don't use the term genocide. It is not a genocide. And by the way, when it comes to genocide, I think you need to be rigorous. You need to abide by the definition of the great Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who took his inspiration from Nuremberg. You should not overuse the term genocide. You would sap its importance by doing that. There are other ways of speaking about the horrors of war and repression. Anyway, we committed to put an end to this ill treatment and persecution of Albanians in Kosovo by the Serbs. And we negotiated for almost a year and a half. We spoke to Milosevic, we spoke to Tuchman, we spoke to all those who had an influence on the situation. We tried to also restrain the Kosovar maximalists who were always tempted to provoke the situation in order to trigger a war They wanted the international community to engage in a war. We also tried to boost the moderate wing, the Rugova camp, and we worked on contacts. And we managed to obtain 2 resolutions from the UN Security Council, which spoke out against Serbian acts and forgot, to some extent, the provocations by the Kosovars. The 2 resolutions, neither of them use the sacramental formula, which you as specialists will, of course, be very familiar with, namely, any means necessary in order to put an end to a situation. That's the language used by the Security Council in compliance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and the use of force. What legitimizes the use of force, provided you can find people who are willing to intervene. So you don't have that formula. You have everything else. You have the condemnation, you have the preparatory steps, but you don't have the sacramental formula. And that is, of course, a dilemma. If you're a legal expert, you will conclude we can't act, we don't have a UN Security Council resolution, strictly speaking. If you're a realist, you will say to yourself, we can't let this situation continue in the Balkans, at the heart of Europe. We have to put an end to what is happening in Kosovo because it's also fanning the flames of the extremists amongst the Kosovars. We'd been negotiating for a year and a half. The outcome of the negotiations had been backed up by all the member states of the EU, all the member states of NATO, all the neighbouring countries. So Robin Cook, my UK colleague, and I said at one point, we need to try one last thing to prove to public opinion that we had really tried everything. We weren't imposing a solution behind closed doors. And we organised a conference in Rambouillet with all the stakeholders, and it nearly worked. But at one point in time, and Madeleine Albright was furious because it so happens there's a lobby in the United States. Incidentally, in the United States, there's a lobby for almost every community around the world, even the smallest ones. There's always a lobby in the US. And there was a small Albanian lobby, and they'd obtained a commitment on the part of the United States to say that the United States would engage in war. And at the last minute, at the last hurdle, this fell because the representatives of the maximalist Kosovars, the Tachikam, refused it because it didn't go far enough. Why did it not go far enough? Because we, in the contact group, were advocating substantial autonomy within Serbia. So we respected Serbian sovereignty. We did not go as far as to talk about independence. I, in particular, did not want to cross that line because I knew that it would lead to a precedent if we were to impose independence within that context. So Rambouillet failed because of, the maximalist position. There was a second session, and ultimately we found that Milosevic, as absurdly as Saddam Hussein, did not understand that it was in his own interest or in the interest of the Serbian community to accept a compromise. So, at that point in time, a difficult decision had to be taken. Exercising power is not the same thing as taking part in a colloquy. So we knew we tried everything, every avenue had been explored, we had no option but to force things vis-à-vis Milosevic, and we had to call NATO in. NATO doesn't decide. It's the same member states, but it's the member states of the contact group, except Russia. Russia stepped out. We called NATO and we said, we need you in order to do this, that, and the other. Now, there were again disagreements. France wanted strikes, military strikes on barracks, on railways, but France also said we must not target civilian population, no cities, and not the bridges in Belgrade. But we'd called upon NATO, and that then brings on board the whole US system. And the US system tends to be flatten everything, and then we'll negotiate afterwards. And there were these real exchanges between Jacques Chirac, who represented my point of view and that of Jospin, and others. Anyway, at the end, Milosevic had to give in. He could have done so at Rambouillet under much better circumstances, but he did it then. So you see how this procedure happened. We didn't exactly have a UN Security Council resolution, but we were also very aware of the fact that it would be worse not to do anything. So we talked about substantial autonomy, we organised things, and then years later, a number of European governments, I was no longer minister and I would not have accepted this, but they accepted the independence of Kosovo. I don't think it's viable for economic reasons, and I also think it's a poor precedent. Incidentally, Russia, since Monday's Putin's third mandate, in his first 2 terms of office, in fact, Putin turned towards the West, and the West turned their backs on Putin. In the third mandate, Putin said, look at what you did with Kosovo. You imposed independence, and he uses that as an analogy in order to apply it to many other examples. If you then take another example, the intervention in Libya, that was Sarkozy and Cameron with the support of the United States of America, although they were in retreat, if you like. I'm torn on this one. You have to remember the context of the time. It was the beginnings of the Arab Springs, or the hopes generated by that. There was a rebellion in Benghazi. There was Gaddafi and his son, who claimed that they would drown them in rivers of blood. Perfectly plausible at the time, and it was difficult not to intervene. Now, those who advocate human rights would say it would have been monstrous not to do anything. So there was an action which was accepted by the UN Security Council. It was Medvedev at the time. Putin was furious, but he was not president at the time. So again, the action was authorized. The beginning of the intervention was authorized. The question, with hindsight, is would it have been possible to conduct the beginnings of the operations, to strike the armored convoys of Gaddafi, and then to stop? And to say, right, now we're going to negotiate, we're going to find a compromise. But of course, in real life, it's never black and white. The Gulf War example that I gave at the beginning is fairly straightforward, but generally speaking, it's always far more complicated than that. Another intervention, which I think you'll easily understand, has to do with Mali. This was under the term of François Hollande in France. You had jihadists in the Sahara region in the north, and they're getting organized, and it becomes very obvious that they can actually take Bamako. The Bamako government sends out a request to all its neighboring countries, all the members of the UN Security Council, and there's also the agreement of the African Union. So even within a multilateral system, there is no objection, not a single reservation. The intervention takes place. It's not because France is overly keen on intervention, but we're the only ones available. The African Union had still not been able to set up its peacekeeping standby force. It's been on the cards for 15, 20 years, but it still wasn't operational. So that case was quite a different one. I could also talk about Rwanda, a very controversial case, particularly in France, less and less elsewhere, but certainly in France. I should perhaps remind you that there were agreements reached in Arusha in the summer of 1993, and that was in fact the objective of the French mission, to prevent military action and to force a political agreement. So agreement in Arusha, there was a wind of optimism, quite surprising one, in fact, with hindsight, and France withdrew all of its troops. Then there was this plane that was brought down, there was the massacre, turned into a genocide, and the question was not whether or not to intervene, it was a question of whether or not to return in order to carry out a humanitarian operation this time. And at the time, this was cohabitation number 2, and we decided we had to go back, we had to return. It's too awful, but we can't just go on a whim. We need a Security Council resolution to back us up. And the events began mid-April 1994. The UN Security Council was given at the end of June to France, and in the meantime, the massacre and the genocide had been broadly implemented. Why did it take so long? Maybe because for the other states of the Security Council, it was a small country, they didn't know it very well, and the US were traumatized by a recent intervention in Somalia, where they'd lost a lot of Marines. So it's a question of image in the United States. There's this strong correlation, double-edged, by the way, between foreign policy decisions and then the way in which that is perceived by public opinion on a day-to-day basis. So anyway, there was this Opération Turquoise, very controversial in France, less so elsewhere, and it happened very late in the day. Why? Because we didn't receive the UN Security Council resolution before that. That's why I wanted to also give you these other examples of intervention based on a UN Security Council resolution. By the way, that's not a panacea. You can have operations based on UN Security Council resolutions which can also be criticized. But here, of course, in this auditorium, we're looking at links between actions and international law. A couple of points that I would like to share with you to encourage you to mull them over. A couple of other points. First question, The West. The West no longer has a monopoly. Does the West still have the right to decree universal law? Now, of course, you might say it's not the West, it's the international community, and in some cases that is true. But when the West believes that it has universal jurisdiction, some European countries have done this. Belgium, for instance, they feel that they can judge anyone, including people who are not Belgian citizens, who do not have any particular connection with the country. It's a slightly pretentious form of universalism. You might think it's marvelous, it moves the law forward, but it's, again, double-edged. It's not entirely dissimilar to the approach of the United States of America. They, too, believe that they have the right to adopt extraterritorial laws in order to sanction, to punish. So intellectually speaking, you've got American laws that allow them to sanction corporations anywhere in the world. Right now, even those who would like to apply the agreement with Iran, as long as Iran is also applying the agreement, well, the whole US machinery intervenes in order to make that impossible. Intellectually speaking, it's not that different from our point of view, which is that we want to spread universal values everywhere. It's a kind of universalist proselytism. It has a good side, but also a bad side. And I think that that is something that you should perhaps think about, given your position. On foreign policy, not just for France, but for other countries too. Right now, there are different principles, very realistic ones, very idealistic ones, coming up against each other. So every day we have to ask, who do we talk to? Who do we negotiate with? Who do we reach agreements with? Every time that you have a visit to a European country by a leader of a country that is not entirely democratic, and that would probably be most countries, inevitably a part of public opinion will say, well, isn't it morally reprehensible to have discussions with such an individual? Realists who have some knowledge of history will say to you, can't you remember the Second World War? How did we defeat Hitler? Roosevelt and Churchill forged an alliance with Stalin. Stalin had already killed more people than Hitler. Mao was to kill more people than Stalin. But you might say that was a different period of time. Nevertheless, there is a debate to be had about that. Decisions are taken by foreign ministers, by heads of state and government. Who are you going to sell these products to? Who are you going to invite to a summit? These are questions that we have to address every single day. And there's no entirely good solution or entirely bad answer. I mean, for a realist, you might say it's better to have some form of contact than no contact. If you have a bit of contact, you might have a bit of influence. Maybe together you'll be able to get a few people out of jail. And maybe you will trigger a process domestically that will help improve the situation in that given country. Part of public opinion will accept that line of reasoning, others not. The media tend to be hostile. And then there might be those who say, well, I'm prepared to be realistic, but this is too much. Sanctions. I was talking about the US policy on sanctions. It's a bit of an obsession with them. There's also a European policy on sanctions, which we could also devote some time to. Not so much the legitimacy, but rather the efficiency or the effectiveness of European sanctions vis-à-vis Russia, for instance. Europeans don't go quite as far. When I was minister, I asked my services to draw up a list of all the proposals for sanctions presented by senators. Presidents don't have to, of course, accede to each request. They can choose. But I asked my services to draw up a list of all the sanctions proposed by senators in the US, and they wanted to sanction 2/3 of humanity. One single country wanted to sanction 2/3 of humanity. It's obviously absurd and inefficient. China would never have developed if this had been actually organized in practice. I'm not going to give you too many other examples. I want to have some time for Q&A afterwards. But I'm just trying to say that every individual case is complicated, more complicated than you might think. And throughout this period, there's been a whole debate in Europe and in France, within public opinion, about the concept of interference. Even if we no longer have a monopoly of power, even if we're being challenged on our values, do we still have the right to interfere in other countries vis-à-vis others? Because that is, of course, a breach of the Charter, the principle of sovereignty. Now, in the UN Charter, there's two aspects, and there's a compromise. at the basis of all that? Do we have the right to interfere? Do we have a duty to interfere? All of that is linked to the public opinion issue. I mean, a government may wish to intervene because there's a dramatic situation unfolding in a given country, because the public opinion back home are looking at their television screens and they're suffering too much. They're horrified by what they're seeing. So you've got diplomacy being deviated, being steered, if you like, by public opinion. Governments intervene in order to put a stop to the suffering of TV viewers back home. That's, of course, not the objective. It's an open debate. I personally have been quite reticent. I understand that we have to intervene when you've got vital aspects, fundamental principles at stake. But I've always asked myself the question, who is intervening, where, how, in order to achieve what? And that brings us back to the question of the UN Security Council and to the assessment of results of such interventions. Finally, what world is it that we live in today? We live in the world of Trump. We live in the world of Putin, of Xi Jinping, of Erdogan, of Netanyahu, of Mohammed bin Zayed, of Mohammed bin Salman. We have the tech giants in the US. We have the tech giants in China. We have trafficking, clandestine migration. In Africa, it's actually more lucrative than drugs trafficking. We have the world of ISIS. That is the world of today. And not all of it can be blamed on Donald Trump. That would be too facile. Trump is just using mechanisms that existed well before him, in an exaggerated fashion, perhaps. Even when he's gone, I don't know whether that's next year or in 5 years' time, even once he's gone, the United States will no longer be the United States that you might remember, the post-war United States that we remember nostalgically. It'll be something else. I don't think we should shed too many tears over multilateralism either, claiming that it's disappeared. In actual fact, nobody ever implemented it properly. Not the United States, certainly. Clinton has had the courage to say openly that when there is a serious problem, we try to solve it first with our friends, then with our allies, and if we don't manage, we just go it on our own. And all those countries who are in favor of multilateralism, well, at some point in time, they'll say, no, I'm sorry, I can't follow the line in this particular case because I have a vital interest that lies elsewhere. So yes, multilateralism as an approach is the best one. Moving forward through international cooperation is smarter. Of course it is. It's always preferable. But let's not delude ourselves. We haven't lived in an entirely multilateral world so far. I'm thinking about all sorts of decisions, economic, technological, or other. Nixon's decision on the dollar in 1971 is a good example. It wasn't an idyllic world. Yes, it's an objective, an aspiration, just like the international community, which has yet to be built, which does not yet exist. An aspiration. That is how we need to look at the real world, in my view. And the more realistic you are, the less destabilized you will be. Every day, when you listen to the radio, when you watch the television, once you've taken on board all of these aspects, you will say to yourself, okay, we've understood. What is it that we can still do under the circumstances? And I'll finish on that point. What can we still do? I've given you some examples, and I think that really it's important to remain clear-sighted in your analysis. It's an obligation, I think. You have to describe things as they are. You have to deconstruct the rhetoric. It just wastes your time. I said it a moment ago, international community, it's an aspiration, an objective, a multilateral system that does wonderful work in order to improve things. Yes, of course, but there's no international community of peoples. There will never be a global president for a global population. That's why we have to work with what we have, work on the inconsistencies and move forward. That said, there are a number of elements of hope. First of all, the extraordinary work being done on international law. You have hundreds of thousands of people around the world constantly forging links, strengthening these links, trying to extend support for these principles, even though every day they might be contradicted by acts of pure force. But still, there's a lot of work going on around the world, a lot of people working away like Benedictine monks, as you might say in the Catholic world, working away at this task. That is really important. Then there's also economic interdependence. Again, a double-edged sword. It could mean domination, it could mean liberation, it could also mean creating solidarity, communities. Incidentally, the part of international law that is most applied is commercial law. That is what makes contracts work. It's what makes the global economy world. It might be too deregulated, too financialized, but nevertheless we have rules, and these rules are enforceable. And when some countries don't play by the rules of the game, like China in the WTO, that will give rise to a reaction, to a protest, to consequences. So there's interdependence. And I think that on the basis of that, we can develop concepts of convergence. Finally, I would talk about the aspirations of peoples. I wouldn't go so far as to say that people around the world today, aspire to live in a Western-style democracy. In fact, unfortunately, modern democracy is running out of steam. It's exhausted. Representative, traditional democracy is constantly being challenged by requests for direct democracy, instantaneous democracy. It's seductive on the one hand, but also terrifying. It's the spectre of the tyranny of the majority. Imagine if all decisions were taken every morning with this kind of device. Every morning you answer a question: are you in favor of bringing back the death penalty? Or are you in favor of dropping taxes? Or are you in favor of tripling the budget for hospitals? Imagine the kind of collective decisions we would be taking. So you have to think about that. Traditional classical democracies, how can they renew themselves? They can be more participatory, more interactive, more reactive, but they shouldn't fall into the trap of the tyranny of the majority. Something to think about. So the future of classical Western democracy is something I'll park for now. That said, wherever you are, whatever the regime, whatever the system, around the world, people all agree in saying they do not want to be assassinated, they don't want to be repressed, they don't want to go to jail without having been judged first, they want to keep a normal family life, a normal personal life. And I think that creates a link, a very strong link. Respect for the law is something that you cannot stop. And I would add the environment to that. Read the UN Charter, in particular the preamble to the UN Charter, a beautiful piece of writing. It starts with this wonderful sentence: we, the peoples of the United Nations. Now, of course, it's actually the three legal directors of the three main countries that drafted the Charter, but nevertheless, the text is beautiful. Please do read it and reread it. It's premised upon universal Western values that we've just spoken about. Obviously, I'm not going to object to that, but I think that what's become more and more clear over time, and it's accelerating, in fact, is this sentiment of ecological interdependence. It's not the future of the planet. That's a meaningless concept. Planets do not need life to survive. It's existence on this planet 3 or 4 generations for now. And I think that awareness can forge close links, slightly born out of panic, but nevertheless an independence. And that could even change our legal concepts. I'm convinced that when it comes to international criminal law, one day we will have the concept of major ecological crimes, the ones that jeopardize the life of others, or the concept of a rogue state. The Americans like to apply this label to anti-American states. I think that the concept of rogue states will be more broadly defined in future, applicable to countries that do not abide by the rules of the game, that do not respect humanity. It also brings us back to the idea floated by Laurent Fabius, who talked about a pact in this area. All of that, I think, is very positive. So, this is what I wanted to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll conclude my lecture with the following words: be as realistic as possible. If you're realistic, you will be less disappointed and you will be more efficient. Thank you.